The rain pounded against the windows of Angelo's bistro as Frank wiped down the last table for the night. It had been another long day, the kind that made his lower back ache and his feet throb inside his worn kitchen shoes. 15 years of running this place had taught him to appreciate the quiet moments after closing, when he could finally hear himself think. Thunder rumbled outside as Frank moved to the kitchen, checking that his staff had properly stored the leftover ingredients. The bistro wasn't anything fancy, just a neighborhood Italian place with checkered tablecloths and photos of the old country on the walls, but it was his. Every scratch on the wooden floors, every dent in the stainless steel counters told a story of his journey since he'd scraped together enough money to buy this place after years of working for others. "See you tomorrow." "Boss," called Miguel, his assistant manager, zipping up his raincoat by the back door. "Don't forget to lock up." Frank waved goodbye, then paused by the sink, letting water run over his hands. The day's receipts had been decent, but not great. Rising food costs were eating into his profits, and that new trendy place 3 blocks over was stealing some of his regular customers. Still, he'd made it through worse before. As he turned off the kitchen lights, a flash of lightning illuminated the alley behind the restaurant through the small window in the back door. Frank froze. For a moment he thought he'd seen something, someone, huddled against the wall by his dumpster. He squinted through the rain-streaked glass, telling himself it was probably just garbage bags, but there it was again. Movement. Definitely a person. No, 2 people. Frank hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. Every city instinct told him to mind his own business. Probably just some teenagers looking for shelter from the storm. Or worse, someone looking to break in. He should just finish closing up and head upstairs to his small apartment above the restaurant. Another crack of lightning revealed more detail. An old woman holding what looked like an umbrella over a small child. They were pressed against the brick wall, trying to stay under the narrow overhang that provided barely any protection from the downpour. Hell, Frank muttered to himself, grabbing his own umbrella from behind the door. Something tugged at his conscience. Maybe the memory of his grandmother's voice telling him to be kind, or maybe just basic human decency. The rain hit him hard as soon as he pushed open the door. "Hey!" he called out, having to shout over the storm. "You okay over there?" The woman looked up, startled. She pulled the child closer to her side protectively. Up close, Frank could see she was older than he'd first thought. Maybe in her 70s, with silver hair plastered to her head despite her efforts with the tattered umbrella. The child beside her couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, shivering in a pink coat that was soaked through. "We're fine, thank you," the woman answered, her voice surprisingly steady despite her circumstances, just waiting for the rain to let up a bit. Frank glanced up at the sky, black and angry with no signs of clearing. "It's not going to let up anytime soon, according to the weather report. You've got somewhere to go?" The woman's hesitation told him everything he needed to know. She straightened her shoulders, dignity intact despite her dripping clothes. "We'll be moving along shortly." The little girl coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Frank wince. He'd heard enough coughs like that growing up in a drafty apartment with too little heat. Without really thinking it through, he found himself saying, "Look, I've got some leftover soup inside. Why don't you come in and warm up for a bit?" Suspicion flashed across the woman's face. Understandable in this city, where kindness from strangers often came with strings attached. "I own the restaurant," Frank added quickly, pointing to the sign above the door. "Angelo's. Well, I'm not Angelo. He was the previous owner." "I'm Frank." The little girl tugged at her grandmother's sleeve. "Nana, I'm cold," she whispered, though Frank could hear her clearly in the momentary pause between thunderclaps. Something in the old woman's face changed, a calculation of risk versus need. "That's very kind. Just until the rain stops," she agreed finally. "I'm Elaine. This is my granddaughter, Lily." Frank held the door open, watching as they stepped carefully into the warmth of his kitchen. They stood awkwardly on the threshold, dripping water onto the tiles. Elaine was trying to keep Lily from touching anything, maintaining what dignity she could. "Bathroom's through there if you want to dry off," Frank said, pointing to a door. "I'll heat up that soup." While they were gone, Frank moved on autopilot, reheating the minestrone soup from lunch and cutting thick slices of the day's bread. His mind raced with questions. What were they doing out there? Where would they go after the rain? It wasn't his business, he reminded himself. He was just offering temporary shelter, a basic human courtesy. Nothing more. When they returned, Lily's face was a bit brighter, though her clothes were still damp. Elaine had done what she could to fix her appearance, combing her fingers through her silver hair and straightening her worn cardigan. "Sit, please." Frank gestured to the small table in the corner of the kitchen where his staff sometimes ate their meals. "It's nothing fancy, just minestrone." "It smells wonderful," Elaine said, helping Lily into a chair. "We don't want to impose." Frank waved away her concern. It would have just gone to waste. This wasn't entirely true. He usually took leftovers upstairs for himself, but the white lie came easily. He watched as Lily took her first spoonful, her eyes widening. "It's so good, Nana," she exclaimed, suddenly animated. Frank couldn't help but smile. There was something about feeding people that still gave him satisfaction after all these years. As they ate, Frank busied himself with final cleanup tasks, giving them space. Through the kitchen windows, the storm showed no signs of letting up. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse, rain now coming down in sheets and wind howling through the alley. "Do you have far to go?" Frank asked casually, trying not to sound like he was prying. Elaine looked up from her bowl, a flicker of something. Worry, pride, shame. Crossing her face. "We're between places at the moment," she said carefully. "We were hoping to meet someone tomorrow who might have a room for us." Frank nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. Homeless. The word hung in the air unspoken. He'd seen enough people on the streets to recognize the signs. The carefully maintained appearance despite worn clothes. The way they carried what looked like all their belongings in 2 small backpacks. Lily had finished her soup and was now eyeing the kitchen with curiosity. "You make all the food here?" she asked Frank. "Most of it," he answered. "I have a couple of cooks who help during busy times. My Nana makes the best cookies ever," Lily declared proudly. "She used to bake for everybody in our building." Elaine smiled softly at her granddaughter. "That was a while ago, Sweet Pea." Frank found himself wondering about their story but didn't ask. Instead, he glanced again at the storm outside and made a decision that surprised even himself. "Look," he said, "I have an apartment upstairs. It's nothing special, just a 1-bedroom place, but there's a couch that pulls out. If you need somewhere to stay tonight just until this storm passes." He trailed off, surprised by his own offer. Frank wasn't the type to invite strangers home. He'd built walls around himself over the years, focused on his business, kept to himself. Yet here he was, opening his door to this grandmother and child he'd met 30 minutes ago. Elaine's expression was a mixture of relief and wariness. "That's very generous, but we couldn't possibly." Another loud crack of thunder cut her off, making Lily jump. The lights flickered ominously. "Please, Nana," Lily whispered, clutching her grandmother's hand. "I don't want to go back outside." Frank saw Elaine's resistance crumble as she looked at her granddaughter. "Just for tonight," she said finally, turning to Frank. "If you're certain it's no trouble, we'll be gone first thing in the morning." "It's no trouble," Frank assured her, though he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. What was he getting himself into? Still, he couldn't send them back into that storm, especially not with the temperature dropping. As he led them up the narrow stairs to his apartment, Frank tried to remember the last time he'd had guests. His place wasn't exactly visitor-ready. Books stacked on the coffee table, mail piled on the counter, a coffee mug from that morning still sitting by the sink. It was the home of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. "Sorry about the mess," he mumbled, quickly gathering a few items of clothing he'd left draped over a chair. "Please don't apologize," Elaine said quietly. This is very kind of you." Lily was already exploring the small living room, her eyes drawn to the photographs on the wall, mostly old pictures of Frank's family and a few of the restaurant in its earlier days. "Is this you?" she asked, pointing to a faded photo of a young boy standing next to an older woman in front of a small house. Frank nodded, surprised she'd noticed that particular picture. "That's me and my grandmother. She raised me after my parents died. Just like Nana raises me," Lily said matter-of-factly, turning to smile at her grandmother. Something shifted in Frank's chest at the simple comparison. A recognition, perhaps, or a memory long buried of what it felt like to be a child dependent on someone who was themselves struggling to stay afloat. "I'll get some blankets for the couch," he said, turning, way before his expression could give too much away. It's not the most comfortable bed, but it's better than nothing. As he pulled linens from his closet, Frank heard Lily's delighted gasp from the living room. Nana, look! He has a chess set. Despite himself, Frank smiled. The old chess set had been his grandfather's, one of the few things he'd kept from his childhood home. He rarely played anymore, had almost forgotten it was sitting on his bookshelf. By the time he returned with the blankets, Lily was carefully arranging the pieces on the board while Elaine watched with a patient smile that didn't quite hide the exhaustion in her eyes. You play? Frank asked the little girl. My dad taught me, Lily answered. Then her face fell slightly. Before he went away, Elaine put a gentle hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. Perhaps Mr. Frank is tired, honey. We should let him rest. It's just Frank, he corrected automatically. And I'm not that tired. Do you want to play a game? The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise them. As the storm raged outside, Frank found himself sitting across from a little girl in damp clothes, playing chess on his grandfather's old board, while her grandmother finally allowed herself to relax enough to doze lightly on his couch. One night, he told himself. He'd give them shelter for one night and then they'd be on their way. What harm could come from that? But watching Lily's face scrunch in concentration as she considered her next move, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A connection, tenuous but real, to something beyond the day-to-day routine of his restaurant. It was unsettling and oddly comforting all at once. Just one night, he repeated silently. But somehow, as thunder shook the windows and rain continued to fall, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that by opening his door, he had set something larger in motion. Frank woke to the unfamiliar sound of hushed voices coming from his kitchen. For a moment, he lay still in bed, disoriented, until the events of the previous night came rushing back. The storm, the grandmother and child in the alley, his impulsive offer of shelter. He glanced at his bedside clock, 6:17 a.m., earlier than he usually woke. The rain had stopped, but gray morning light filtered through his window, suggesting the clouds hadn't fully cleared. Frank pulled on a t-shirt and sweatpants before making his way down the short hallway. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Elaine stood at his stove, spatula in hand, flipping what looked like perfect golden pancakes. Lily sat at his small kitchen table, folding paper napkins into intricate shapes. Good morning, Elaine said, noticing him hovering in the doorway. I hope you don't mind. I wanted to thank you for your kindness. Frank ran a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Elaine replied simply. Sit. Coffee's ready. Frank found himself obeying, oddly thrown off balance by having someone else take charge in a kitchen, any kitchen. The coffee she poured him was stronger than he usually made it, but good. Really good. Nana makes the best pancakes, Lily announced, pushing a paper creation toward Frank. I made you a crane. For good luck. Frank picked up the folded paper bird, surprised by its intricacy. Thank you. Did your grandmother teach you this too? Lily shook her head. My mom did. Before she went to heaven. An awkward silence fell. Frank sipped his coffee, unsure how to respond. Elaine saved him by sliding a plate of pancakes in front of him. These look amazing, Frank said, genuinely impressed by their perfect golden brown color and fluffy texture. Where did you find the ingredients? I hope you don't mind that I rummaged a bit, Elaine said. You had the basics. I added a touch of vanilla extract I found in the back of your cupboard, probably from when you made Christmas cookies. Frank couldn't remember the last time he'd baked Christmas cookies. That vanilla must have been there for years. He cut into the pancakes and took a bite, then paused, fork midair. These are incredible, he said, not bothering to hide his surprise. The pancakes were light, fluffy, with a hint of something he couldn't quite identify. What else did you put in these? A ghost of a smile touched Elaine's lips. Just a pinch of cinnamon and a little lemon zest. Simple things make all the difference. Frank took another bite, thinking. In his restaurant, he'd been serving the same basic breakfast menu for years. Nothing special, just standard fare. Eggs, bacon, basic pancakes. Nothing with this kind of flavor. You've done this professionally, he said. It wasn't a question. Elaine sat down with her own modest portion. I was a cook at a diner for 27 years. And before that, I learned from my mother, who had a small bakery in our town. Nana makes the best pies, too. Lily chimed in, carefully unfolding and refolding her napkin into a new shape. Everybody used to say so. Frank studied the older woman with new interest. What happened, if you don't mind me asking? Elaine's eyes met his, and Frank saw both pride and weariness there. Life happened. My daughter, Lily's mother, got sick 3 years ago. Cancer. I quit my job to take care of her and Lily. Her voice remained steady, but her hands tightened around her coffee mug. After she passed, I couldn't go back to the diner. New management, new rules. They'd already hired someone else anyway. I'm sorry, Frank said, meaning it. Elaine nodded, acknowledging his sympathy without dwelling on it. We managed for a while. I found other work, cleaning houses, babysitting. But then I fell and broke my wrist last winter. She flexed her right hand unconsciously. Medical bills piled up. We fell behind on rent. And here you are, Frank finished quietly. And here we are, Elaine agreed. But not for long. We'll be out of your hair after breakfast. There's a shelter across town that sometimes has rooms for families. Frank watched as Lily continued folding her napkin, her small fingers moving with surprising dexterity. Despite her circumstances, she seemed calm, focused. He wondered how much of that was natural resilience and how much was a child's adaptation to a difficult situation. These really are exceptional pancakes, Frank said, returning to safer ground. Thank you. Cooking is something they can't take away from you, Elaine said, no matter what else happens. Those words hung in the air as they finished breakfast. Frank's mind kept returning to the dessert situation at his restaurant. His previous baker had left 2 months ago, moving to another state. Since then, they'd been buying pre-made desserts from a wholesale bakery. They were adequate but nothing special, nothing that would make customers come back specifically for them. Can you bake? He asked suddenly. Elaine looked up, surprised by the abrupt question. Yes, it was my specialty at the diner. Why? Before Frank could respond, the sound of his phone alarm broke the moment. 7:00 a.m. Time to head downstairs and start prep for the day. I need to open the restaurant, he said, standing and gathering the plates. Take your time. No rush to leave. The words came out before he'd fully thought them through. Elaine shook her head. You've done more than enough. We'll clean up and be on our way. Frank hesitated, the half-formed idea in his mind still taking shape. Actually, would you mind stopping by the restaurant before you go? I'd like to talk to you about something. Curiosity flickered across Elaine's face, but she simply nodded. Of course. Downstairs, Frank moved through his opening routine on autopilot, his mind elsewhere. Miguel arrived at 7:30, eyebrows raising slightly at Frank's distracted state. Everything okay, boss? He asked, tying his apron. Yeah, fine, Frank answered, then paused. Miguel, what do you think about our dessert situation? Miguel shrugged. Those wholesale cheesecakes are okay. Not great, but okay. Why? Just thinking we could do better, Frank said vaguely, checking the reservations for lunch. Light as usual for a weekday. By 8:30, the morning prep was well underway, and Frank had almost convinced himself he was crazy for what he was considering. Then the back door opened, and Elaine and Lily appeared, backpacks in hand. Ready to leave. Thanks again for everything, Elaine said, holding out her hand formally. Instead of shaking it, Frank gestured toward the small office in the back. Could I talk to you for a minute? Miguel can show Lily the fish tank in the dining room. Miguel looked confused but gamely offered his hand to Lily. Want to see our fish? We have an angelfish named Tony who does tricks. Once they were alone in the cramped office, Frank dove right in before he could second-guess himself. I need a baker, someone to make desserts in-house. Nothing fancy, pies, cakes, cookies. Things that would complement our menu. The job's yours if you want it. Elaine stared at him, clearly caught off guard. You don't know me. I know enough, Frank countered. Those pancakes told me more about your cooking skills than a resume would, and you need a job. I don't have anywhere to live, Elaine pointed out, practical despite the hope that had flickered briefly in her eyes. The shelters are across town. Transportation would be... There's a storage room next to the office, Frank interrupted, gesturing to a door across the hall. It's not being used for much. Small, but it has a window. It wouldn't take much to put a bed in there, maybe a small dresser. He was making this up as he went along, yet as he spoke, the plan solidified in his mind. Elaine's expression turned wary. I don't accept charity, Frank. It's not charity. It's business, he insisted. You'd work for the room and a salary. Fair exchange. I need someone with your skills, and you need a job and a place to stay. Simple as that. And Lily? There's a good school 3 blocks away. She could come here after school, do homework in one of the booths during the slow hours. Frank hadn't thought this through completely, but the words kept coming. This neighborhood is full of families. I bet we could find her friends right around here. Elaine was silent for a long moment, studying Frank's face as if trying to detect any hint of pity or deception. Finally, she asked, "Why would you do this for strangers?" Frank thought about the paper crane still sitting on his kitchen table upstairs, about the photo of him and his grandmother that Lily had noticed immediately, about second chances and the random kindnesses that had helped him along the way. "Let's just say I know what it's like to need someone to take a chance on you," he said simply. Besides, those pancakes really were exceptional. "Imagine what your pies could do for this place." A small smile tugged at the corner of Elaine's mouth. "My pies are better than my pancakes. Then we have a deal?" Frank held out his hand. Elaine hesitated only briefly before taking it. "On a trial basis," she said firmly. 2 weeks. If it doesn't work out, then we'll figure something else out," Frank finished. "But it's going to work out." From the dining room came the sound of Lily's delighted laughter, followed by Miguel saying something about Tony the angelfish doing a backflip. "I should warn you," Frank added. "My business partner Dave comes in on Fridays to review the books. He's more about the numbers than the people. He might not understand this arrangement right away." Elaine straightened her shoulders. "I've dealt with difficult managers before. And I'm a hard worker, Frank. You won't regret this." Looking at her determined expression, Frank believed her. What had started as a simple act of kindness during a storm was turning into something he hadn't expected. A risk. Yes, but one that felt right in a way that few decisions in his life had. "Let me show you the kitchen," he said, leading the way. "You can start today if you want, maybe just some simple cookies for the dinner service. See how it goes." As they walked through the kitchen, Frank noticed how Elaine's eyes took everything in, assessing the equipment, the layout, the ingredients on hand. She moved with the confidence of someone returning to familiar territory after a long absence. "The oven runs hot on the left side," she noted, barely glancing at it. Frank chuckled. "How did you know that?" "Experience," she replied with a slight shrug. "Most restaurant ovens do. You learn to adapt." By the time Lily returned from viewing the fish, chattering excitedly about Tony's supposed backflip, a transformation had already begun. Elaine had tied an apron around her waist and was examining the pantry contents with a critical eye, mentally cataloging what was available and what she would need. Frank watched them, the grandmother finding her place in his kitchen, the child adapting to yet another new environment with remarkable resilience, and wondered if he'd just made the best or worst business decision of his career. Either way, he realized things at Angelo's Bistro would never be quite the same again. 3 weeks had passed since the rainy night that brought Elaine and Lily into Frank's life, and Angelo's Bistro was already feeling the effects. The small chalkboard sign near the entrance that once simply listed daily specials now prominently featured Elaine's dessert of the day, and customers were taking notice. "That's the third person this week who's come back, specifically asking for the apple crumble," Miguel told Frank as they watched a regular customer scrape the last bits of cinnamon-flecked topping from her dessert plate. "We're onto something here, boss." Frank nodded, trying not to look too pleased. The storage room conversion was still a work in progress. He'd installed a proper bed frame and mattress, put up a curtain for privacy, and added a small dresser he'd found at a thrift store. It wasn't fancy, but Elaine had transformed the space, with a colorful quilt and a small vase of fresh flowers that Lily changed every few days with, whatever they found growing between sidewalk cracks or in the small park down the street. Lily had started at the neighborhood school and was already making friends. Frank had worried about her adjustment, but the girl seemed to bloom in the stability of their new routine. She spent afternoons at a corner booth in the restaurant, doing homework or drawing on the backs of old menus that Frank saved for her. "We're using twice as much cream as we used to," Frank commented, scanning the week's inventory list. "And these specialty ingredients Elaine keeps requesting aren't cheap." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "You're not thinking of cutting back, are you? Because I'm telling you, people are coming in just for those desserts. I had a table last night that skipped dinner entirely and just ordered coffee and pie." Frank shook his head. "No, not cutting back. Just noting the changes." The truth was, despite the increased costs, the restaurant was doing better. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The numbers were headed in the right direction for the first time in months. The kitchen door swung open. and Elaine emerged carrying a tray of something that filled the restaurant with the scent of warm chocolate and orange. Her silver hair was neatly tucked under a bandana, and she moved with purpose, her confidence growing daily as she settled into her role. "Brownies with orange zest and a hint of cardamom," she announced, setting the tray on the counter. "For the dinner service. I've cut a few into samples if you want to try." Frank took a small piece, the warm chocolate melting on his tongue. The orange and cardamom were subtle but transformed what could have been an ordinary brownie into something special. "This is really good, Elaine," he said honestly. A flush of pleasure colored her cheeks. "It's my daughter's recipe. Lily's mother. She used to make these for bake sales at school." Frank noticed how Elaine had started mentioning her daughter more frequently in recent days. Not long stories, just small references that kept her memory alive. It seemed healthy, this gentle remembering. "Lily still at school?" he asked, checking his watch. "Parent-teacher conference today. I'll pick her up at 4. Elaine replied, already turning back toward the kitchen. "I want to get the bread started for tomorrow before I leave." Frank nodded, then remembered. "Dave's coming in tomorrow. Monthly review." Elaine paused. "Your business partner. The numbers man." "That's him." Frank had mentioned Dave several times but had been vague about exactly how he'd explain the new living arrangement to his bottom-line-focused partner. "Don't worry about it. Just be yourself." Elaine gave him a look that said she wasn't worried in the slightest and disappeared back into the kitchen. The next morning, Frank arrived earlier than usual, wanting to make sure everything was in perfect order before Dave showed up. He found Lily already at her usual booth, sketchbook open in front of her. "You're up early," he commented, hanging his jacket by the door. Lily held up her drawing, a surprisingly detailed sketch of the restaurant's interior. "I'm making a picture of everybody's place," she explained. "See? That's Miguel's station, and there's where Nana works, and that's your special chair where you do the money stuff." Frank smiled, impressed by her observation skills. She'd captured not just the layout but small details. The crack in the tile near the kitchen door, the way the afternoon light hit the far wall, even the crooked picture frame he kept meaning to straighten. "This is really good. Lily, you've got a talent," she beamed at his praise. "My teacher says I should enter the art contest. The winner gets their picture in the library for a whole year." "You definitely should," Frank agreed, then noticed the time. "Is your grandmother up? Making special bread for today? She says the grumpy money man might like it." Frank suppressed a laugh. "Trust Elaine to have a strategy for handling Dave. I'm sure he will." By noon, the restaurant was in its usual lunch rhythm when Dave arrived, laptop bag slung over his shoulder, expression already set in its typical frown of concentration. In his mid-50s with thinning hair and rectangular glasses, Dave was the practical counterweight to Frank's occasional impulsiveness, a necessary partnership that had kept the restaurant financially stable through tough times. "Numbers are up," Dave noted without preamble, sliding into the chair opposite Frank's desk in the small office. "Not dramatically, but consistently for the past 3 weeks." "What changed?" Frank took a deep breath. "We have a new baker, making desserts in-house now." Dave's eyebrows rose slightly as he tapped at his laptop. "I see the increased inventory costs, but they seem offset by higher sales." "Interesting." He peered at Frank over his glasses. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Hiring decisions are supposed to be joint. This was the moment Frank had been dreading. It was kind of a special circumstance. Her name's Elaine. She's got years of experience and her desserts are incredible. "Where'd you find her? That culinary school downtown finally producing decent graduates?" Frank hesitated. "Not exactly. She and her granddaughter were homeless. I let them stay one night during that big storm last month, found out she was a professional cook and offered her a job." Dave's fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. "Homeless," he repeated flatly. "You hired a homeless person and—" "Wait, let them stay? Stay where exactly?" "I converted the storage room next to the office. Temporarily," Frank added quickly, seeing Dave's expression darken, "until they find a proper place." Dave closed his laptop with a sharp snap. "Have you lost your mind? The liability issues alone. Try the orange cardamom brownie before you say anything else," Frank interrupted, pushing a small plate across the desk. Dave stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "A brownie? You think a brownie changes the fact that you've made a major business decision without consulting me? That you've moved strangers into our commercial property? Just try it," Frank insisted. With a look of exasperated disbelief, Dave picked up the brownie and took a bite. His expression remained stony for a moment, then subtly shifted. He took another bite, chewing thoughtfully. "This is quite good," he admitted reluctantly. "But that doesn't change." The office door opened and Elaine appeared, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The rich aroma of freshly baked bread filled the small space. "You must be Dave," she said, her voice calm and professional. "I thought you might like to try today's focaccia. Rosemary and sea salt with a touch of honey in the dough." Dave looked from Elaine to Frank and back again, clearly thrown off balance by her composed demeanor. Whatever he'd expected a homeless baker to look like, Elaine. Neat, dignified, and exuding quiet competence, wasn't it? "Thank you," he said automatically, accepting the small plate she offered. "I've prepared a cost analysis of my dessert program," Elaine continued, placing a neatly written sheet of paper on the desk, "including projections for seasonal specialties and a few ideas for expanding our breakfast offerings on weekends. I believe we could capture more of the Sunday brunch crowd with minimal additional inventory costs." Dave stared at the paper, then at Elaine. "You did a cost analysis?" "I managed inventory ordering at my previous job," she replied simply. "Numbers are just another kind of recipe. The right balance matters." Frank watched with growing amusement as his normally articulate partner struggled to reconcile his assumptions with the reality standing before him. "I understand. Your concerns about the living arrangement," Elaine continued, her voice matter of fact. "It's unconventional, I know. But I assure you it's temporary. I'm saving a portion of each paycheck, and we should be able to afford a small apartment by summer." Before Dave could respond, the sound of children's laughter drifted in from the restaurant. Lily had returned from school with a friend, both of them clutching papers that looked like art projects. "Nana, look what we made," Lily called, then paused when she saw the adults in serious conversation. "Oh, sorry," she whispered, backing away. "It's okay, honey." "We're almost done," Elaine said. "Why don't you show Mr. Frank your project while I finish talking with Mr. Dave?" Lily nodded solemnly and turned to Frank, holding up a colorful painting. "It's for the art contest. Ms. Patterson says it might win." Frank studied the painting. It showed the restaurant from the outside, but with incredible attention to detail for a child her age. The sign, the flower boxes, even the crack in the front step were all captured with surprising accuracy. "This is amazing, Lily," Frank said honestly. "You've really got a gift." Dave was watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. His eyes moved from the child to Elaine, then to the cost analysis sheet, and finally to the half-eaten brownie in his hand. "The art teacher thinks she could get a scholarship to the Saturday program at the community center," Elaine said quietly. "If we're still in the area, that is." It was a subtle reminder of what was at stake, not just a job and housing, but stability for a child who'd already lost too much. Dave sighed, a long exhale that seemed to deflate his earlier indignation. "The storage room isn't up to code for residential use," he said finally. "We'd need to install proper ventilation, a smoke detector, possibly upgrade the electrical." Frank felt a surge of hope. Dave was thinking in terms of solutions, not objections. "I could help with the work," Elaine offered. "I've done basic home repairs before." Dave shook his head. "We'd need a licensed contractor for some of it." He glanced at Frank. "My brother-in-law's company could probably do it at cost if we provide the materials." Frank tried to hide his surprise at this unexpected shift. "So, you're okay with the arrangement?" "I didn't say that," Dave replied, straightening his glasses. "But the numbers don't lie. Whatever she's doing in the kitchen is working." He turned to Elaine. 3-month trial period. We'll bring the room up to code, but this is a temporary solution. And I want weekly updates on the dessert program with detailed sales figures." Elaine nodded, the hint of a smile touching her lips. "I can do that. Thank you for the opportunity." After Dave left, having extracted several promises from Frank about future consultation on major decisions, Frank found Elaine in the kitchen, already preparing for the dinner service. "That went better than expected," he said, leaning against the counter. Elaine smiled as she rolled out pastry dough. "Men like Dave respect competence and results, and good bread never hurts," Frank laughed. "You figured him out pretty quickly." "People aren't so complicated once you learn to really see them," she replied, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Everyone wants respect, security, and to feel that what they do matters." Frank watched her work, struck by the simple wisdom in her words. In just 3 weeks, Elaine and Lily had become an integral part of the restaurant, and he realized with some surprise of his life. Outside in the dining room, he could hear Lily explaining her painting to Miguel, her voice animated with the pure enthusiasm only children can muster. The sound of it filled the restaurant, with a kind of life that had been missing before. What had begun as one night's shelter from a storm was becoming something neither Frank nor Elaine had anticipated. A second chance for all of them. Summer arrived, with a wave of heat that had customers lingering over cold drinks in Angelo's Bistro. The restaurant had transformed over the past 6 months, not with fancy renovations or new furniture, but with the subtle yet profound changes that came from Elaine's influence in the kitchen and Lily's presence in the dining room. The storage room conversion had been completed with surprising efficiency. Dave's brother-in-law had installed proper ventilation, upgraded the electrical system, and even managed to fit in a tiny bathroom with a shower stall. Though small, the space was now a legal living area, and Elaine had made it home with simple touches: curtains sewn from fabric remnants, a small bookshelf built by one of their regular customers, and walls brightened by Lily's artwork. "Order up," Elaine called, pushing 2 plates through the kitchen window. "Table 7's cherry pie and Table 12's lemon tart." Frank grabbed the desserts, noting how the vibrant colors of the fruits contrasted beautifully with the perfectly golden crusts. Presentation had never been his strong suit, but Elaine had an instinct for it. Simple food made special with thoughtful touches. "Mrs. Garcia asks if you'll share the recipe for the cherry pie," Frank told her when he returned. "Says it reminds her of her grandmother's." Elaine smiled as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Tell her I'll write it down for her before she leaves." Frank hesitated. "You sure? That's your special recipe." "Recipes are meant to be shared," Elaine replied. "Besides, she'll still come here. Some things just taste better when someone else makes them for you." Frank nodded, understanding what she meant. The restaurant had always provided food, but now it offered something more. The comfort that comes from dishes made with genuine care, the kind that reminded people of home and family. The bell above the door jingled, and Lily burst in, followed by 2 friends from school. At 9 years old, she had an energy that filled the room, her earlier shyness long forgotten. "Nana." "Mr. Frank, look." She thrust a letter toward them, her face flushed with excitement. "I got in. The art program accepted me." Frank took the letter, scanning its contents. The prestigious Saturday art program at the community center had offered Lily a full scholarship for the upcoming school year. "This is wonderful, Lily," he said, genuinely proud. Her artwork had improved remarkably, with several pieces now framed and hanging on the restaurant walls. Customers often commented on them, and a few had even offered to buy them. "We need to celebrate," Elaine declared, her eyes shining. "How about a special dinner tonight? You can invite your friends." As Lily and her friends settled into their favorite booth, already discussing what they wanted to eat, Frank noticed the thoughtful expression on Elaine's face. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded slowly. "More than okay. It's just, when we came here, I was just hoping for a temporary roof over our heads. I never expected all this." She gestured around the restaurant, which was busier than it had been in years. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming." "If you are, don't wake up," Frank replied with a smile. "We need you here." The afternoon passed in a pleasant rhythm of customers and food, the routine now familiar and comfortable. At the slow period between lunch and dinner, Frank sat at his desk reviewing the books, a task that had become significantly less stressful since Elaine's desserts had started drawing in new customers. A knock at the office door interrupted his calculations. Dave stood there, manila folder in hand. "Got a minute?" he asked, unusually hesitant. "Sure," Frank replied, clearing space on his desk. "Monthly review isn't for another 2 weeks, though." Dave sat down, placing the folder between them. "This isn't about the restaurant. At least not directly." He opened the folder to reveal real estate listings. "I've been doing some research on affordable housing options in the neighborhood." Frank stared at him in surprise. "For Elaine and Lily?" Dave nodded. "The room upstairs was supposed to be temporary, remember? It's been 6 months. Frank felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. "They're doing fine where they are. The room passed inspection." "It's not about the room," Dave said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "It's about giving them a real home. A proper place." He tapped one of the listings. "This one's a 2-bedroom apartment just 4 blocks away. Reasonable rent, utilities included. Building owner owes me a favor. He'd waive the security deposit. Frank studied his partner with newfound respect. For all of Dave's focus on numbers and bottom lines, he'd clearly been paying attention to the human element too. That's really thoughtful of you, Frank admitted. But can they afford it? I've run the numbers, Dave replied, pulling out another sheet covered in his neat handwriting. If we adjust Elaine's salary to reflect the true value she's bringing to the business, and factor in what they're saving by not paying rent currently, yes, they could manage it. Frank leaned back in his chair, conflicted. The logical part of him knew this made sense. Elaine and Lily deserved their own place, a real home. But another part of him had grown accustomed to their presence, to Elaine's humming in the kitchen early mornings and Lily's cheerful greetings when she returned from school. Have you mentioned this to Elaine? He asked. Dave shook his head. Thought you should be the one to bring it up? You have a closer relationship. Before Frank could respond, a commotion from the dining room caught their attention. Raised voices, the sound of the front door slamming. Frank hurried out of the office to find Miguel trying to calm an agitated health inspector, a thin man with a clipboard and a severe expression. What's going on? Frank asked, stepping between them. Mr. Garcia, I presume? The inspector said, consulting his clipboard. I'm Thomas Wells, City Health Department. We've received a complaint about people living in your commercial space. Frank felt his stomach drop. We have all the proper permits. The living quarters were renovated to code. The inspector raised an eyebrow. My records don't show any residential permits for this address. Commercial only. He peered around Frank toward the back of the restaurant. I'll need to inspect all areas, including any unauthorized living spaces. Frank glanced at Dave, who had followed him out of the office. Dave gave a small nod. He'd handle this, and stepped forward with his most professional demeanor. I'm Dave Wilson, co-owner. We'd be happy to show you around, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding. If you'll just give me a moment to retrieve our paperwork. As Dave led the inspector toward the office, Frank noticed Elaine standing in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. She'd heard everything. It'll be fine, Frank assured her, not entirely convinced himself. Dave has copies of all the permits. Elaine's eyes were troubled. Who would file a complaint? Everyone in the neighborhood knows about our arrangement. Frank shook his head. I don't know. Maybe a competitor. The new place down the street hasn't been happy about losing customers to us. From the corner booth, Lily watched the scene with wide eyes, her celebration forgotten. Frank gave her what he hoped was a reassuring smile, then followed Dave and the inspector to the office. 20 minutes later, the situation had only grown more tense. The inspector sat rigidly in Frank's chair, examining the permits Dave had provided. These permits were filed correctly, he admitted reluctantly. But they're still under review. Final approval hasn't been granted yet. He tapped his pen against the clipboard. Technically, no one should be living in that space until all permits are approved. But the work has been completed to code, Dave argued. We used licensed contractors. Everything meets or exceeds requirements. The inspector remained unmoved. Rules are rules, Mr. Wilson. I'm going to have to issue a citation and order the living space vacated until final approvals come through. How long will that take? Frank asked, dreading the answer. Current backlog is about 6 to 8 weeks. Frank exchanged a worried glance with Dave. 2 months. Where would Elaine and Lily go for 2 months? A soft knock interrupted them. Elaine stood in the doorway, composed but serious. May I speak with the inspector? The inspector looked startled but nodded. Elaine entered and introduced herself with quiet dignity. Mr. Wells, I understand you're just doing your job, but I want you to know what this place means to us. Her voice was steady, without a hint of pleading. 6 months ago, my granddaughter and I had nothing. Today, because of this restaurant, this community, we have stability, purpose, and hope. The inspector shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The work on our room is solid, Elaine continued. You can inspect it yourself. Frank and Dave did everything right. Hired professionals, used quality materials. The only issue is paperwork timing. I sympathize with your situation, ma'am. The inspector replied, his tone softening slightly. But I don't make the rules. No, but you decide how to enforce them, Elaine said. My granddaughter was just accepted into the community center's art program. If we have to leave now, she'll lose that opportunity. We've put down roots here. The restaurant had fallen silent, customers sensing the gravity of the moment. From the dining room came the sound of a chair scraping back, then footsteps. Lily appeared beside her grandmother, clutching a folder of her artwork. "These are my drawings," she said, her voice small but determined as she handed the folder to the inspector. "That's our home, and that's Mr. Frank, and that's Nana in the kitchen. Please don't make us leave." The inspector looked startled as he accepted the folder, opening it to find detailed, colorful drawings of the restaurant, its people, and the neighborhood. He flipped through them slowly, his expression softening. "You did these?" he asked Lily. She nodded. "I'm going to be an artist someday. My teacher says I have good perspective." Something in the inspector's face changed as he looked from the drawings to the child, then to Elaine. He closed the folder and handed it back to Lily. "The living space needs a fire extinguisher near the entrance," he said finally. "And a carbon monoxide detector. Install those today and I'll classify this as a warning rather than a violation. I'll expedite the permit review myself." The tension in the room dissolved instantly. Dave quickly volunteered to get the required safety items immediately. As the inspector rose to complete his formal inspection of the kitchen, he paused beside Elaine. "My mother raised me alone," he said quietly. "We had our own housing struggles. Your granddaughter's very talented. Make sure she keeps drawing." After the inspector left, the restaurant erupted in cheers. News had spread quickly among the customers, many of whom were regulars who had come to know Elaine and Lily well. Several had been prepared to offer temporary housing if needed. Later that evening, as the celebration dinner for Lily's art program acceptance transformed into a broader celebration of their continued home, Frank found himself watching the scene with a curious mixture of relief and revelation. What had begun as a simple act of kindness on a rainy night had created something powerful, not just a home for Elaine and Lily, but a true community. The restaurant, once just a business to him, had become the center of a web of relationships, stories, and shared moments. Dave approached, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He offered one to Frank. "To dodging bureaucratic bullets," he said wryly. Frank accepted the glass. "To family," he countered, his gaze moving to where Elaine was serving her special cherry pie to a table of delighted customers, while Lily showed her friends the inspector-approved living space with pride. Dave followed his gaze, nodding slowly and understanding. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I still think they should have their own apartment eventually, but I'm beginning to see why you're in no hurry to make that happen." Frank smiled. "They'll move on when they're ready. For now," he gestured around at the bustling restaurant, at the warmth and life that filled every corner. "For now, this is exactly where they belong. Where we all belong," he added silently, raising his glass to the unexpected family he'd found. 1 year had passed since that rainy night when Frank had found Elaine and Lily huddled in the alley behind his restaurant. The anniversary wasn't something they had planned to celebrate, but Lily had marked the date on the kitchen calendar, drawing a little house with a heart around it. "It's our finding home day," she explained when Frank noticed it. "The most important day ever." The simple phrase stuck with Frank as he moved through his morning routine. Finding home. He'd owned this building for 15 years, had lived in the apartment upstairs for most of that time, but he hadn't really understood what home meant until Elaine and Lily had entered his life. Angelo's Bistro had flourished over the past year. What had started with Elaine's desserts had expanded into a revamped menu that blended Frank's Italian staples with Elaine's home-style cooking. Word had spread, and the restaurant now regularly had a waiting list on weekend evenings, something Frank had never experienced before. "We need to talk about expansion," Dave said during their weekly meeting, pushing a folder of numbers across the desk. "We're turning away too many customers. The space next door is still for rent." Frank raised his eyebrows. "Expansion? That's a big step. A necessary one," Dave replied, tapping the folder. "Look at these numbers. Revenue is up 62% from this time last year. And it's not just the food, though that's exceptional. It's the atmosphere. People feel something when they come here." Frank knew what Dave meant. The restaurant had always been his livelihood, but now it felt alive in a way it never had before. Regulars didn't just come for the food. They came to chat with Elaine about her latest recipes, to see Lily's newest artwork, to be part of the community that had formed around their shared tables. "Let me think about it," Frank said, not ready to commit to such a significant change. "And I should talk to Elaine. Her kitchen would double in size." Dave nodded, then hesitated before pulling out another document. "There's something else. I had my lawyer draw this up." Frank took the paper, scanning its contents with growing surprise. Partnership agreement? For Elaine. She deserves it, Dave said simply. This place is what it is now because of her, and it would give her the financial stability to finally get that apartment we talked about. The one on Maple Street is available again. 2 bedrooms, good neighborhood, walking distance from both the restaurant and Lily's school. Frank felt a complicated mix of emotions. He'd known this day would come eventually. Elaine and Lily deserved their own place, their own space. The converted room had served its purpose, but it was still just that. A converted storage room. Yet the thought of them moving out, of not hearing Lily's footsteps overhead or Elaine's early morning humming in the kitchen, left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. I'll talk to her, he promised, tucking both documents into his desk drawer. The opportunity came later that afternoon. During the quiet period between lunch and dinner service, Elaine was experimenting with a new recipe, the kitchen filled with the scent of roasting garlic and herbs. Smells amazing, Frank commented, leaning against the doorframe. New special? Elaine nodded, adjusting the oven temperature. Roasted vegetable tart with that goat cheese from the farmer's market. Thought it might work as a lunch option. She wiped her hands on her apron. Something on your mind? You've got that look, Frank smiled. After a year of working side by side, Elaine could read him too well. Dave has some ideas. Big ones. He explained about the expansion plans and the partnership offer, watching her expression carefully. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a cautious joy. Partner? Me? You've more than earned it, Frank said honestly. This place wouldn't be what it is without you. Everyone knows that. Elaine was quiet for a moment, taking it all in. And the apartment? Dave mentioned it again. It's a good place. Safe neighborhood close by. Frank tried to keep his voice neutral. Lily would have her own room. Space for a real art studio. Elaine studied him, her eyes knowing. But you have mixed feelings about it, Frank sighed. No point denying it. I've gotten used to having you both around. The place would feel empty without you. A timer dinged, and Elaine turned to remove the tart from the oven, giving herself a moment before responding. The golden crust was perfect, vegetables arranged in a colorful spiral. We've gotten used to being here too, she said finally, setting the tart on a cooling rack. More than used to it. It's become home. She met his eyes directly. But maybe it's time for us all to think about what's next. Not just what's comfortable. Before Frank could respond, the back door burst open and Lily rushed in. Face flushed with excitement, her art teacher following behind more slowly. Nana. Mr. Frank, look. She thrust a letter into their hands. I won. My picture won the regional contest. Frank scanned the official-looking letter, pride swelling in his chest. The drawing Lily had entered, a detailed portrait of Elaine working in the restaurant kitchen, had been selected for a traveling exhibition of young artists. There would be a ceremony, a small scholarship for future art education, and the possibility of further opportunities. This is wonderful, Lily, Elaine exclaimed, pulling her granddaughter into a tight hug. Lily's art teacher smiled warmly. She has exceptional talent. The judges were particularly impressed by her ability to capture emotion in her subjects. She turned to Frank. The exhibition opens next month at the downtown gallery. We hope you'll all attend the opening reception. After the teacher left, Lily could hardly contain her excitement, bouncing around the kitchen describing every detail of how she'd learned about the win. Frank watched her, marveling at the transformation from the shy, frightened child he'd met in the rain to this confident, blossoming artist. We need to celebrate, he decided. Special dinner tonight. Whatever you want, Lily. Can we invite everyone? She asked immediately. Miguel and Dave and Mrs. Petrovich from next door and Mr. Lee from the bookstore and everyone, Frank agreed, laughing. We'll close the restaurant to regular customers and make it a private party. Word spread quickly through their network of friends and regular customers. By evening, the restaurant was filled with people who had become part of their extended family over the past year. Miguel arranged tables into one long communal setting, while Dave, who once would have calculated the cost of closing for a private event, arrived with an elaborate cake decorated with miniature paintbrushes and an easel. As Frank looked around at the gathering, he was struck by how much had changed. The restaurant that had once been simply his business had become the heart of a community. People from all walks of life sat together, sharing food and stories, united by their connection to this place and to the unlikely family at its center. Midway through the evening, Elaine clinked her glass for attention. The room quieted as she stood, looking slightly nervous to be the center of attention. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate Lily's achievement," she began. "A year ago, we had nothing but each other. Now, thanks to one man's kindness on a rainy night, we have all of you." Her eyes found Frank's across the table. "Sometimes the smallest decisions can change everything." She raised her glass. To Frank, who opened not just his door but his heart. To new beginnings, second chances, and finding home in unexpected places. To Frank. The room echoed, glasses raised. Frank felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. As the evening continued around him, he found himself remembering his conversation with Elaine earlier. Maybe it's time for us all to think about what's next, not just what's comfortable. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Frank noticed Lily showing Dave her sketchbook, the two of them deep in conversation at a corner table. "She's asking him about architecture," Elaine said, coming to stand beside Frank. "Apparently she's designing her dream house, complete with art studio and restaurant kitchen." Frank smiled. "She thinks big." "She's learned that it's okay to dream again," Elaine replied softly. "We both have." In the comfortable silence that followed, Frank made his decision. "I'm going to sign the lease on that apartment tomorrow," he said. "For you and Lily." Elaine looked at him in surprise. "Frank, you both need your own space," he continued. "A real home, not a converted storage room. And I'll need that room for the restaurant expansion anyway." Understanding dawned in Elaine's eyes. "You're going through with the expansion?" Frank nodded. "And offering you the partnership." "You've earned it, Elaine. This place is as much yours as mine now. And Dave's," she reminded him with a small smile. "He's the one who suggested it," Frank admitted. "Turns out our numbers man has a heart after all." Elaine laughed softly, then grew serious. "You know, moving to our own place doesn't mean we're leaving. The restaurant will still be here." "We'll still be here." "I know," Frank said. "It's just, I've gotten used to having a family again. Haven't had that in a long time." Elaine's expression softened. "Family doesn't end when someone moves down the street, Frank. If anything, it gives us room to grow." She glanced over at Lily, now showing her sketches to Miguel. "That girl adores you. You're the closest thing to a grandfather she's ever known." The word grandfather caught Frank by surprise, though he realized it shouldn't have. At 62, he was certainly of grandfather age, though he'd never expected to play that role for anyone. "You know," Elaine continued thoughtfully, "that apartment has a spare bedroom. For guests." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Are you inviting me to stay over?" "For Sunday dinners," she clarified with a smile. "I think it's time you had someone cooking for you occasionally." Across the room, Lily looked up and caught their eyes, waving them over to see her latest creation. As they joined her, Frank felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was what it meant to find home. Not just a place, but people who became your anchors in the world. 1 year ago, he had made a split-second decision to open his door to strangers on a rainy night. He couldn't have known then how completely that simple act of kindness would transform his life, filling the empty spaces he hadn't even recognized were there. As the evening came to a close and the last guest departed, Frank stood in the doorway of his restaurant, their restaurant now, watching as Lily and Elaine gathered their things, chatting animatedly about plans for the exhibition opening. "Ready to head upstairs?" he asked. "Ready," Lily confirmed, slipping her small hand into his as naturally as if she'd been doing it all her life. Tomorrow would bring changes, a new apartment to prepare, expansion plans to finalize, a partnership to cement. But tonight, as they climbed the familiar stairs together, Frank knew with absolute certainty